Okay, let's talk about FDR and the New Deal, redefining democracy through new political rights, economic security, and social justice. Earlier, we talked about some of the causes of the Great Depression, and I have them listed here. You had overproduction of both agricultural and industrial goods, an unequal distribution of wealth, the overextension of credit coming out of the new credit industry, and people living beyond their means, the international economic situation brought on in large part by World War I and the way that it ended, practices in the stock market such as speculation and buying on margin. These practices were essentially buying stocks with money that you didn't have, in some cases even taking out loans to buy stocks. This occurred not only with individuals, but even more predominantly with banks and businesses. The culture of consumption created by the roaring 1920s and the Second Great Industrial Revolution. And finally, a lack of regulation by the federal government. As we know, Herbert Hoover did not cause the Great Depression, but he did not deal with it well. He was in a long line of Republican presidents, minus the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who had essentially formed a very friendly relationship with big businesses and allowed them to do pretty much what they wanted. He believed in the free market, and that if you just allowed the free market to fix itself, that prosperity would be right around the corner. But as we know, many of the policies and actions that he did take were too little, too late. Some of those included the Harley-Smoot tariff, which passed the second highest tariff in U.S. history. It actually worked in the beginning, but long-term failed miserably, and also angered our neighbors to the north and Canada, as Canada cut off their markets to U.S. goods. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was formed under Hoover as an independent agency and gave about $2 billion to bail out state and local governments. It was used to help lend money during the Great Depression and was later expanded under the New Deal, but again, it was seen as too little, too late under Hoover. Let's not forget Hoovervilles, the shanty towns of those who were unemployed and foreclosed upon. Also Hoover blankets, which were newspapers that people used to cover up. And of course, Hoover tents, which were people's empty pockets turned inside out. And finally, the Bonus March or the Bonus Army debacle, which were World War I veterans who had been promised pensions that they were to be paid in 1945. But 14,000 of these veterans marched on Washington to try to get early payment of these pensions. Hoover did not direct the violence, but he did approve of General Douglas MacArthur and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will become famous generals in World War II. He did approve of their actions as they went in to disassemble the veterans. There were a couple situations, one where some veterans were killed, and then later when all of the protesters were removed from in front of the White House, they were gassed with tear gas, led by the U.S. Army and with General MacArthur at the head. This was seen as a huge slight and disrespect to America's veterans who had fought in World War I. So here comes FDR. He was a man of action, which many believed, even though his policies didn't all work, or perhaps they pushed the level of involvement that the government should have in the economy, they saw him as someone who was willing to try things and take risks. Hoover had been seen as a do-nothing president, and FDR is going to win in a landslide. He uses this to claim a mandate or almost a divine power or a blessing to follow his plan that he called a New Deal for the American people. But essentially, his aim was to use government as an agency to improve human welfare and to repair America's economy. He was a practical guy, extremely charismatic. He exuded a warmth and understanding of people. He knew how to handle the press, and did so by having a weekly address, better known as fireside chats, and provided dynamic leadership in a time of crisis where he showed a willingness to experiment. As a side note, many argue that FDR today would never be elected because of his disability and being in a wheelchair. However, at this time, that was pretty much a non-factor, as most of his press time through the media was over the radio. The purposes of the New Deal were threefold: relief, recovery, and reform. And the overall objective was to save capitalism. So keep the 3 R's in mind as we go through some of these programs that are part of Roosevelt's New Deal. He first issued the 3 R's in a fireside chat in 1934, just about a year and a half after his election. His belief in the New Deal through these 3 R's were to stress federal aid through public works, revitalizing the economy, and amending the laws that had allowed the Depression in the first place. Roosevelt also tried something that had not been done in modern America since the Industrial Revolution, and that was he didn't bring in politicians to help him make these decisions. Instead, he brought in the best of the best. He brought in what was known, the group was known as what was known as the Brain Trust, and they were specialists and experts in their field, particularly in economics. He also looked at different economic theories that dealt with government spending, how to deal with deficits, how to use public works to put people back to work. He believed that the government should help prime the economic pump. In other words, he saw it okay to go into debt in order to put people back to work, thinking that there would be a return in the long term. And there was. However, his policies do not end the Great Depression. The biggest thing that he does is that he inspires confidence in the American people. The first New Deal begins a period also known as the 100 Days. Now, I don't have a slide for this, but let me just tell you a little bit about the 100 Days. The 100 Days were his first 4 or so months in office, and they began immediately after his inauguration and went through the early summer of 1933. This is where FDR immediately, as soon as he gets into office, says that he is ready to bypass the traditional festivities and he is ready to start an aggressive plan to resuscitate the American economy. He immediately called for a special session of Congress, also declared a 4-day bank holiday to keep the economy from crashing further, and he did this also to put everything on hold while the administration figured out what sort of legislation it needed to pass. Roosevelt had originally planned to pass just the banking laws during this special session, but received so much cooperation from Congress that he decided to keep going to see how many more of his New Deal programs and ideas he could implement. And he did, did implement many new programs and pass legislation that dealt with farming, industry, banking, and social reform. Some of the things we'll get to in a second, but they include the establishment of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And during these 100 days total, Roosevelt passed 15 major laws, gave 10 speeches, and spoke to Congress 15 times, urging them to pass his reform measures. He also held a lot of press conferences, cabinet meetings, and this 100-day period set a precedent for immediate action upon the inauguration of presidents, particularly in crisis. The first 100 days of most presidencies are now considered to be a very important period in the president's term in order to set a tone for his new administration. We've also seen this same kind of action from presidents since FDR, all the way up to Obama, who made several big decisions within the first couple of months of his inauguration. In this first New Deal and during this first 100 days, the emphasis was reform. His position was a little bit more conservative. I'm not saying conservative as in Republican, but conservative in its tone about how much the government's going to try to interfere in the economy. His main goal is to help the economy recover. He wants to create an economic nationalism or a new confidence in the economy by raising prices and creating the illusion of scarcity. Because if he's able to do that, if he's able to create the illusion of scarcity, then he's hoping it will drive demand up if supplies look low, and will help to restore some of the market values of both agriculture and industrial goods. The biggest beneficiaries in this first New Deal are big businesses and agricultural businesses. The National Recovery Act is one of the first big things that FDR passes. It's also sometimes called the National Industrial Recovery Act. So it means the same thing. It's helping industry to recover by creating a partnership of business, labor, and government. He believes that by the government taking a larger role in business and labor, that he's able to attack the Depression head on by controlling prices, controlling wages, and helping to control competition, which he believes he can make more fair. More specifically, the National Industrial Recovery Act allowed FDR to regulate industries and help to permit some oligopolies and monopolies. And it does have an impact on helping to stabilize big business. The first Agricultural Act is another big part of the New Deal, perhaps the most famous. And it's even made even more famous when he passes the second Agricultural Act, which is then challenged in court and leads to an important Supreme Court decision which strikes down the AAA as unconstitutional. But this first Agricultural Adjustment Act was to help farmers, and it actually paid farmers to grow less and to reduce their production of some basic crops, especially cotton, wheat, tobacco, hogs, and even corn. The idea again was to create the illusion of scarcity. Farm goods had become so cheap that people were had flooded the market with goods, and they were still not bringing home enough to pay their bills and save the farm. So he wanted them to stop, to pull back, to help lower the supply in order to help increase the demand and therefore raise the prices. The money for the Agricultural Adjustment Act came from a tax on processors in businesses that dealt, for example, with flour millers, where you created flour from grain, and also meat packers. And then this also passed the price, raised prices and passed this cost on to the consumer. So there were some downsides to the AAA, but the idea was to help stabilize the prices. Yes, prices would go up on consumers temporarily, but it would help to stabilize the economy. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration was a New Deal program created in 1933, also by the Roosevelt administration, but headed by a guy named Harry Hopkins. This purpose was to help relieve unemployment. During its two-year existence, FERA provided $3.1 billion to operate work projects. It helped to institute the CWA that we'll talk about in just a second, and its work was ultimately taken over by the WPA. This part of the New Deal gave jobs to over 20 million people, helping them to recover from economic depression. So as I mentioned, this is one of the big programs, and the offshoots of it are the CWA and the PWA that we'll get to in a second. But the idea that the government becomes the employer. They create agencies that create jobs, pay those people. The government may go in debt, but they feel like stabilizing the economy and putting people back to work is better for everyone long term. Once people are back in work, then they could perhaps later raise taxes and get rid of the deficit. That was the idea. Okay, so we'll get to the CWA, the PWA, and then talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is perhaps the most famous program for FDR and the New Deal, when we come back in just a second.